Okay, try it again. Good evening, and thank you for coming out on our rainy night. If last night's presidential debate is any indication there is interest in talking about foreign policy, whether or not we learned anything from the discussion last night, or at least much of that is new, that is another matter. But hopefully you're going to be learning some stuff tonight from this panel. We've assembled an impressive group here to speak with us tonight, and I'm going to introduce the moderator, Jackie Miller, excuse me, and then she's going to in turn take it over because you can see I can't keep the names straight, and she's going to introduce the others, and she's going to moderate the discussion of the panel and then bring in the audience. But Jackie Miller is president and CEO of the Seattle's World Affairs Council. That's really the premier evening discussion group. They do all kinds of stuff here in the Seattle area. So if you're not familiar with them, you should check them out on the website. Prior to joining the World Affairs Council, Jackie served as Director of External Relations at the Independent Diplomat in New York, where she worked with marginalized democratic political actors to help them navigate the United Nations and other international diplomatic fora. Before that, she was a senior associate at the East-West Institute in New York, where she ran U.S. programs. She particularly focused on issues of national security policy, the U.S.-Russia and the U.S.-China relationship, as well as nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation issues. So the only one that's not mentioned here tonight is climate, but we'll get to that, I'm sure. She has many other accomplishments to her credit, which I won't go into here, but please take a look at a full biography on the GAC website at the college/GAC. And as Jackie is fond of saying, her first international travel was when her family moved from Australia to the U.S. when she was very young, and her fascination with international affairs began in her childhood, sitting around the dinner table and having nightly conversations on international issues. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie.
Thanks, Larry. And I hope you don't all expect me to have an Australian accent anymore, because that kind of went away. Came over when I was a kid. And Larry, I kind of like the new mission statement you've got for the World Affairs Council. We do all kinds of stuff. I'm going to adopt that one, I think. Thanks, Larry. I'm pleased to be part of this discussion tonight. And Larry has assembled a really terrific panel for our discussion on the foreign policy challenges that will be facing the new president. There are many, they are quite daunting, and several of them have taken center stage in this election. And in fact, I would argue that foreign policy seems to be taking an outsized role in this election, more than you would typically expect. I saw an interesting chart this morning on the post-debate mop-up back and forth on Twitter, and tallying up the issues that were discussed across all three debates, all three presidential debates and the vice president debate. All the issues that the candidates discussed. And the issue mentioned most often was Russia and Putin. It wasn't a domestic issue, it was Russia and Putin. And the second issue mentioned the most often was ISIS, terrorism, Al-Qaeda. Again, not a domestic issue. The third issue mentioned most frequently was taxes, not Donald Trump's returns or lack thereof, but tax policy. And the fourth issue was his tax returns or lack thereof, unless you take Syria and Assad together, which this chart didn't do, but actually if you take Syria and Assad together, they were the fourth. So of the top 5 issues discussed in the vice president and all 3 presidential elections were foreign policy issues, which I think is quite striking. And this election this campaign has been an interesting one so far, and it is less than 3 weeks away now. I'm sure for many of you that cannot come soon enough. But after the election, the winner, whoever she or he is going to have to start thinking about governing and walking back some of this rhetoric that has been such a part of this election, and reassuring scared, unsure allies and partners, and trying to project a unified American voice in global affairs. And that's going to be extraordinarily difficult, but on the upside, it's going to make for a really interesting discussion tonight. So I'm going to do a brief who's seated here at the table with me, and then we're going to go get started because there's a lot to talk about, and we are going to do a hard stop at 8 o'clock. Just a couple of really quick housekeeping points before I tell you who's going to help us all get smarter tonight. There's a camera, so we're on the record. So just keep that in mind. When you're asking a question, you'll all get a turn. If you have something that might bing, beep, vibrate or otherwise distract the conversation and make everyone turn around and stare at you, and we'll make sure the camera goes to you as well. Please be sure to turn that off. And we are going to have a discussion here first, and then we will turn it over to you and ask you to join in the discussion as well and ask your questions, and I'll give a few ground rules on that before we turn it over, but the ground rules are very, very easy. Basically, ask a question, not give a speech. That's basically it. So to my left is Jill Dougherty. Jill Dougherty is a 30-year veteran of CNN. You started very young with CNN.
I was a child.
Jill, you were a child. And she has reported from more than 50 countries in the course of her career. She was where I first got to see Jill on my television screen was when she was CNN Moscow bureau chief. And I don't know if you'd call it a claim to fame or not, but Jill has actually been kissed on the cheek by Vladimir Putin.
No questions, please.
She's currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Center for Scholars in DC. She's been a scholar at the Kennan Institute, which is also in the Wilson Center, and also at the Kennedy School at that little school called Harvard back in Massachusetts that a couple of you may have heard of. To my right, which is no indication of where he stands, and this is not arranged by political scale at all, is Bill Center. Bill retired from the Navy after a 35-year career, retired as Rear Admiral. He saw his career took him many places, as naval careers often do. But one of my favorite tidbits on your career is that you were Deputy Director for International Negotiations for both Colin Powell and General Shalikashvili. You went, and final assignment was right in our backyard here as Commander of Navy Region Northwest.
Right.
Down in Bremerton Way. And you went from the Navy to the nonprofit world, which must have been a shock there, to running the...
The Navy's kind of a nonprofit in its own way.
Or to running the Washington Council on International Trade. So, and even though he's retired from the Navy and then he retired from Wichita, he's still trying to retire by currently lecturing at the Evans School at the University of Washington. And is there a class coming up you might want to mention?
In the winter quarter, I'm pleased to announce that I will be co-teaching the graduate seminar in U.S. foreign policy with Jill Dougherty. And I think it's going to be a really fabulous class. So if you know any grad students at the university, let them know that this class is going to be offered in the winter quarter on Thursday afternoons, and Jill and I are going to have a great time teaching together.
And on my far left, again, not indicative of anywhere we might stand on the political spectrum, is Derik Broekhoff. Derik is senior scientist at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, which is not in Stockholm, it's in Seattle. He's worked on energy and climate policy for nearly 20 years and has joined us at the World Affairs Council in some terrific conversations on the UNFCCC. Jill's also joined us, and now I know, Bill, you're going to have to join us as well. It's kind of a rite of passage. He's helped inform numerous state, national, and multinational policy initiatives on climate issues, and is currently really focusing on how local and national governments can work together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You may have seen on the poster, we had a fourth speaker, Joe Borich, lined up. Unfortunately, he got a very nasty bug while traveling in Taiwan last week and is kind enough to not infect us all and is staying at home. But we have, we can still have a really good conversation about China, and you might channel Joe at some point just to keep the conversation going. Okay. So I want to start, and if I keep doing this, this is actually my watch. I'm not checking how many steps I have, but I'm really low today. This is my watch, so although I guess there's a clock there. So I want to start with some public opinion polling that came out recently. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs released a report last week on public opinion, mass public opinion, and foreign policy issues. And overwhelmingly, the number one issue that Democrats, Independents, and Republicans identified as the number one security threat to the United States is international terrorism. And it was by far and away number one. Democrats, 74% of Democrats said this is the number one issue, 83% of Republicans, and 81% of independents. So this is an issue that the mass public agrees is something that is very concerning. And the Obama administration has made the battle against ISIS and the international terrorism brand that they are a top priority in the Middle East. But it is, of course, an incredibly difficult target. Mosul was a part of the debate discussion last night. There is a battle going on right now to try and wrest Mosul from ISIS. We've had Donald Trump talk about his plan, Hillary Clinton talk about her plan, and I want to start with asking Bill, realistically, when Trump or Clinton comes into office in January, what can they do differently on international terrorism? Can there be a significant change in policy, or is the best we can expect really just a change in rhetoric?
That's a really good question. And let me start by clarifying a couple things. First of all, we were talking about where we are on the political spectrum. Regardless of my name, I consider myself to be a centrist. I don't think of myself as being on the left or the right. That's not as easy as it once was because people have somewhat lost track of where the center is. But with regard to the current candidates, I will say, in my humble opinion, it appears very unlikely that Mr. Trump will be elected, but we will address that possibility. It's a clear difference there. If Mr. Trump is elected, there's probably no possibility of a significant change in course. If Secretary Clinton is elected, I think it is possible that we could see a change in course. And I think it would be good if we were able to change course. It's alarming to me that terrorism is rated so high as a threat because, frankly, as an expert in this area, I don't consider terrorism to be the number one threat. I don't consider it to be probably even in the top 4. And I think we devote a disproportionate amount of our resources to that threat, primarily because public opinion is so overwhelmingly forcing that to happen. So I think for Secretary Clinton, if she's elected, her biggest challenge is going to be to try to help lead the American people away from their fear of terrorism, which was understandably generated in the wake of 9/11. I think part of it is realizing that our fear, that this fear that we have is kind of giving the terrorists the win in that battle. And it's not healthy for us, it's not helpful for us, and it's costing our nation a tremendous amount of resources and leading us down some very ill-advised courses of action in the international arena. For example, we've lost sight of what our real objective is in the Middle East. Our real objective in the Middle East is peace and stability. It is not defeating ISIS. Somehow defeating ISIS has become the overriding driving objective. We've been very successful militarily against ISIS, but you wouldn't know that from reading the paper or listening to people. The number of ISIS fighters has been reduced by over 75%. The acts of terror that they've committed have gone down dramatically. And even though we sense that there's this threat in the United States, the risk of being killed by a terrorist in the United States is still lower than being struck by lightning or killed in a plane crash or eaten by a shark. In all honesty, you may not wish to believe that, but that is the case. But we devote a disproportionate amount of our national treasure to that. So the challenge for Secretary Clinton will be a huge leadership challenge, because making a course change in this area is going to require a massive communication, education, sales job that's going to have to take place over a long time. I'm confident that she understands everything that I just said, but you understand how hard doing that would be. I mean, even if you believe it intellectually, emotionally, it's very difficult. So that's a pretty tall order. I think another great thing that will happen if Secretary Clinton is elected is that Dr. Carter will have at least 2 more years as Secretary of Defense, a steady hand on the helm at a time when we really need that, and some other leadership in the national security apparatus will stay in place. They will be willing to help us make a course adjustment here that I think will be helpful over the long haul. So I don't know if I answered your question, but other than that, I have no opinion.
Jill, are you similarly lacking an opinion?
I always have an opinion. But I would say, I know what Bill is talking about. You know, it sounds a little counterintuitive at first glance, but it is true that if you look at terrorist organizations and their actual existential threat to the United States, they are not going to overthrow the United States. But that said, they can create very dramatic chaos, and God forbid that they should get any type of nuclear weapons or even dirty bomb material. It could create complete panic, and that's one of the problems. Right now, the emotion, I was listening in the car this morning to an NPR thing, and the man who was being interviewed described what ISIS does, and he started out by, they burn people alive in cages, you know, so that gets your attention when you hear things that are like that. I won't go into it. I think the biggest threat right now is the inability of liberal democracies to provide jobs and good lives to the people who live in those so-called liberal democracies in both Europe and the United States. I think it is a huge threat. Maybe we could talk about this later, but I do believe when you think of how society and how jobs are changing and employment is changing, and you look at artificial intelligence and you look at robotics and how the jobs that we're talking about now, mining, you know, a lot of these industries that really are dying and will never come back. These are the threats in both Europe, especially in Europe, and in the United States, that people are losing faith in their governments to provide what they need. They're very frightened. And so when you have terrorism as an overlay on that, and two things I would say, the terrorists kind of like vermin move from place to place. If you look at some of these reports about terrorism in Syria or any place else, I have seen this more often than not. If we destroy ISIS in X, they will move to Y. And it's really kind of the whack-a-mole approach. It's very, very difficult. And then also domestic recruitment, self-recruitment is a problem. I just got back from Minneapolis, where there's a significant Somali population, and they themselves know some of the problems of their young kids, self-radicalizing. So, yeah, I basically agree with Bill. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, so I'll leave it there.
Well, Bill wants to jump in with another comment, which is great, because anyone
I just completely agree with what Jill said, and I would like to tie her comment and my comment together in two ways. Number one, addressing the problem that she highlighted as that should be at the top of the list, takes the resources that are being diverted into other areas. And number two, it also requires that same sales job. Because what's actually happening in the economy and what people think is happening in the economy aren't the same things. Jobs are going away, and they are not going to come back. When Hillary Clinton blurted out that truth in West Virginia that, hey, the coal mines aren't going to reopen, you know, she was just blasted. And so it's going to require that same kind of leadership to help people understand that what's happening in our economy is what I call economic dislocation. If you're a 50-year-old forklift operator and you lose your job in this economy, you will never get another job with the same pay and benefits, because they can hire a 19-year-old with better reflexes, no family, lower insurance costs, and lower wages, and your experience doesn't count for much, and you are not going to get retrained to become a computer programmer. The whole apparatus we have to build to allow our workforce to transform to match the needs of the new economy doesn't exist, and it's going to require presidential level leadership to make that happen. And I agree that that is a greater existential threat than terrorism.
Right. Well, I want to turn briefly, if we can, to Syria, because U.S. troops are there, and Russian troops are there. And President Obama has announced his red line in Syria, only to have it trampled, which kind of gave the Russians an entry. So we've got, Russia aggressively asserting itself into the mix as a player. They're at the table, but they're also in the air and on the ground in Syria, really complicating the situation. So it's the same question about Syria, and I'll start with you, Jill. Can we expect the next president to not necessarily come to a solution, but find a way forward? Aleppo is a tragic situation. We can't even get Aleppo right. Can the next president do anything about Syria?
I think it's absolutely one of the most intractable problems that we have. And it's very, very complex because it's connected to so many countries in the region, and there are so many different forces fighting right now that good luck to the next president. I don't really have a clear view of what Trump would do. I actually don't. Perhaps he doesn't really have policy. I do know, right now you have a couple of things. You have great concern over the civilians and how to protect them at this stage, but even, let's say, getting them out of Aleppo, which is being bombed. And Hillary Clinton has talked about having safe zones, no-fly zones. And I thought it was interesting, not to begin with small things, but when she was asked last night, what about the safe zone idea? And she said, well, it wouldn't happen overnight. You would have to negotiate. And that is obvious because if you have a safe zone to protect civilians who would try to get out of some of these areas and probably move north, there's no question that you're going to have to negotiate with Russia. Because otherwise, if you create a safe zone and the Russians come in to bomb an area, you're going to have to shoot down the Russians, which of course begins World War III. So it's very complex. I would say the factor that we have right now is for whoever becomes president, the facts on the ground are that Assad is still in power after how many, 5 years, I guess?
11, yeah,
total, yeah, 5 years. And several years of the United States saying, and I was at the State Department covering this when it happened, Assad has to go. Assad has to go. Well, he hasn't gone. He's still there. And the Russians are there as a real fait accompli. And so any new president is going to have to realize, and they do, I think, that you are going to have to deal with Russia at the table. And that was, I think, part of what the Russians wanted all along, to be a factor in whatever solution we have. And I'm not very hopeful. I don't see a lot of solutions at this point. It's going to have to require dealing with the Russians. But, the Russians, one of the problems that we always have with the Russians is, if you remember the war that they had in their own country against the Chechens, the Chechen War, which a couple of wars actually, which were very, very brutal. And what you're seeing now is the Russians carrying out much of the same policy that they carried out in Chechnya, which is basically like carpet bombing, instead of, very pinprick, which is kind of what we do, a lot more controlled and more protective of civilians. What they're doing now is you just unload as many bombs as you can and go in there and flatten the place in order to, quote, get the terrorists. But I don't think anybody is under any illusion that they believe that the United States ever could really separate the, the good fighters from ISIS. And so right now they say, America, you can't fulfill your part of the bargain, which is to get the good guys separated. And so we're going to go in there and do the job for you. And that is why you have all this bombing. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of disparate. It's a little confused, but I think the situation is very, very confusing.
Yeah. Bill?
All these things do tie together. And we're in the first answer, I was fairly dismissive of terrorism. I was talking in the context of an existential threat to the United States. When you talk about the situation in the Middle East writ large, not just Syria, but since I started working in the national security policy arena in 1976, the number one thing on the list has always been peace in the Middle East. We said if we could, the number one goal, the thing we have to solve, the nut we have to crack is peace in the Middle East. And despite the fact that we've had that at the top of the list for more than 30 years, we've made no progress. And one of the reasons for that is every time we start to make progress, the terrorists on the left or the right do something disruptive that throws the process off the track. So this is another sales job the next president is going to have to do. Americans, we are problem solvers. We think that the problem of terrorism can be solved and the problem of Syria can be solved. Neither can be solved. And it's not going to be, a president isn't going to be able to stand up and say, look, there's nothing we can do about terrorism because if we make the targets impossible, they'll just pick different targets. If we make one method impossible, they'll just pick a different method. That's the nature of terrorism. And this, as Jill admirably pointed out, the situation in Syria is so complicated, it's not going to be resolved in and of itself. It has to be part of a whole regional solution, which isn't going to happen in the next 30 years. So those who think that either President Trump or President Clinton, or even if President Obama or some other mythical president continued for the next 8 years would solve this problem, don't have a realistic understanding of the challenge and the nature of the challenge from my vantage point.
Well, I want to turn to something that a lot of people do consider an existential threat, and that's climate change, because we've got to get Derik into the conversation. President Obama has called climate change the defining global challenge of the 21st century, and his administration has rolled out initiatives to cut back greenhouse gas emissions, negotiated the Paris Agreement. In the two presidential debates, or the three presidential debates, climate change was given, passing mention at best. Hillary Clinton gave one speech mainly on climate change in Miami with Al Gore standing by her side, and that was just 2 weeks ago that she kind of brought it up. And she's praised the Paris Agreement as our last best chance to solve the climate crisis, and has criticized Trump's promise to cancel the deal. But the Paris Agreement is going to come into force 4 days before the election. It's going to come into force on November 4th. It is an international agreement. The U.S. has certain obligations. What could a President Trump do in regards to the Paris Agreement? Can he come into office and say, nope, we're done?
Yeah. Not in so many words, but the agreement is of a nature that it really requires the buy-in of all of the signatories for it to work, and in particular the United States. So just a little bit of background on the Paris Agreement. It was signed in Paris last year, the end of last year, and it was really in a lot of ways the culmination of 20 or more years of negotiations on climate change. So going back to 1992, we had the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed by the first Bush administration, that basically laid out a framework for international negotiations with the aim to avoid dangerous interference in the global climate system. And over the years, they've met every year to continue these negotiations, and have produced international agreements. The Kyoto Protocol is the most famous of those, or infamous, depending on your point of view. There was the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, which many considered to be a failure, essentially. And the Paris Agreement is the next big agreement under this framework. And it's a big deal for a couple of reasons. One is it's the first time that all the countries of the world have basically set a goal for what they want to do in terms of trying to avert dangerous climate change. That is, they want to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius and avoid the dangerous consequences in terms of climate change that would come along with that. And the agreement actually says they want to meet that goal and, if possible, go beyond it. So that was a big deal just in terms of the ambition of the agreement to try to really avoid the worst consequences of global warming. It was also a big deal because it's the first time that every country in the world has actually come forward with a commitment for what they're going to do to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to climate change, and really do something. The Kyoto Protocol really only imposed obligations on industrialized countries. The United States would have been one of them, but large emitters of greenhouse gases like China, India would not have been held to any goals, targets under that agreement. So this is a big deal in that sense. It lays out a framework for countries to track their progress and increase their ambition over time. And it has some legally binding elements in the sense that countries are required to report their emissions and to set more ambitious targets. Right now, if you add up all the commitments that countries have made around the world, they are not sufficient to get us to that 2-degree goal. Depending on who you consult, we're still looking at 2.5 to 3.5 degrees of warming, which many scientists consider would be extremely dangerous in terms of the consequences. So there's still more progress that's needed there. But it's not legally binding in the sense that countries are held to those commitments. The commitments are voluntary. They're called nationally determined contributions. And overall, the agreement itself is it's a little like Tinkerbell in the sense that it's only real and it will only be effective if everybody believes in it and takes the actions to follows through on their commitments essentially. The fact that it's come into force. Is actually pretty remarkable. I think it's almost a record for a major international agreement. The Kyoto Protocol took 8 years from the time it was agreed until the time it was ratified by enough countries to come into force. So this is less than a year. It shows, I think, very hopeful level of commitment by the countries of the world. And I think it's in no small part to the leadership of the United States and of China. So that's another dimension to this. But what that means is the next president, were he or she to try to withdraw, legally it would not be possible to withdraw from the agreement. But it would be quite easy to basically decide not to follow through on the U.S. commitments. And that would have, I think, very serious consequences in terms of the collective will to follow through. If the United States, which is now the second biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, is not playing ball, it's really tough to expect the other countries of the world to step up as well.
So give China the number one emitter, an easy
China,
excuse to go.
Yeah,
Right.
Exactly.
May I?
Please, Bill.
Again, you'll notice that there's a theme in my comments, leadership, economics, et cetera. As I mentioned to Derik earlier, I was actually part of the team that helped to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol. And so one of the things I have an appreciation for is how difficult these negotiations are. They're extremely difficult. And when you try to get all 200 plus countries in the world to sign on to an agreement this complicated, it requires a certain amount of flexibility. To hold Malawi to the same standards as we're going to hold the United States, it requires that Tinkerbell aspect to it. We need to help probably, would you say, 40 or 50% of the other countries. The United States and the other industrialized countries are going to have to help them if they're ever going to achieve their goals. I don't think that's bad. I think we've progressed in the right direction. I felt at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, you remember the language in this country, the bumper sticker was, it's a flawed agreement. And it was a flawed agreement because it didn't actually accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish. We needed a better agreement. This agreement is better, but it's also flawed. And this is where the leadership piece comes in. The United States should be a world leader and say, we're going to set the example and we're going to work to get a better long-term agreement that approaches the objectives that Derik was talking about. One thing that's good and encouraging is we have a happy confluence of economic events. The cost of clean energy is coming down. The availability of clean energy is coming down. The awareness is going up. And the need for new jobs is, that Jill was talking about. And so if we're looking for a place to put people to work, the clean energy economy is one of those places. It's not going to be a one-for-one transfer that every coal miner is going to end up building solar panels. But there are ways. Elon Musk is building his new gigafactory out there in the desert. And I think we are at a tipping point in this country where public opinion, economic incentives, the need to retrain the workforce, all those things are going to align in a very positive way that's going to help us all of a sudden start to move in a positive direction on this. I don't know if you agree with me on that or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But it is going to require presidential leadership.
You keep coming back to that, Bill.
Yeah.
I want to do just one more quick follow-up question on climate, and we'll probably come back to it. I've just got a couple more topics I want to get to before we turn it over to you. But we weren't a part of the Kyoto Protocol. Can there be progress in climate going forward without U.S. leadership, without the U.S. leading the charge?
There's a waffly answer to that, which is, how do you define progress? But if we really want to make inroads to addressing the problem of climate change, I think we absolutely need U.S. leadership. And if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of people consider it to be failed, but I don't think it's an overstatement to say that it was the lack of the participation by the United States that largely made it a failure.
Amen. If the United States, if the president would have said at the time, this is a flawed agreement, so we're not going to ratify it, we want to lead the effort to build a better agreement, we would have gotten to Paris 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
And so it's not, U.S. leadership is not only essential, it will ultimately make the difference in how fast or whether or not we're able to get it done in time.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And, just for context, I think there were two countries that didn't ratify Kyoto. One was Afghanistan, the other was the United States. So it's, and it just given our leadership in technology, given the size of our economy, given that we are the second largest emitter in the world, the U.S. absolutely has to be there.
And once we realize we can make money at it, we'll start.
Yeah. I am not an expert in this area, but I just wanted to ask Derik if I could, just one quick question. There are two factors that keep coming up in this debate, just general political issues, people who don't believe it's a problem, the deniers of climate change. And then this other thing that the world government is going to tell America what to do. So how do you, I'm not that worried about the first because obviously eventually people will come to the conclusion that it's a problem. But the second one, how would you, if you were the president, as Bill's saying, with leadership, how would you make that argument to the American people that some faceless bureaucrats out there aren't going to tell us what to do? It's, I guess, our wanting to do something. But how would you finesse that?
So in a way, I think it's been finessed in the form of the Paris Agreement. Our fingerprints are all over this agreement, and it's actually, I think, fairly remarkable in the sense that it's structured in a way that everyone is coming forward with a commitment, but it's a voluntary commitment. There is no overarching architecture like there was in the Kyoto Protocol, which basically, held countries to a legally binding target. This is all countries saying, okay, we're all going to come together. We're going to, do what we say we're going to do. And for the United States, there's a commitment to reduce emissions 26 to 28% within 10 years, essentially. And it's up to us to follow through on that commitment. There's no UN body that's going to hold us accountable to that. We are responsible for reporting what our emissions are on a regular basis, but we do that already. It really is, our architecture of collective agreement, voluntary action, but with the kind of moral force behind having this international structure to it to realize it.
I think the other piece of that, the leadership piece, if I was the president, I would say we aren't adhering to somebody else's standard. We're going to set the standard. And we are going to encourage, facilitate, and help everyone else come up to the standard. We are going to lead the way. We're not going to sit back and take orders. It's not somebody else telling us what to do. We're going to show everybody else what needs to be done and how to do it.
That's right.
And that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah.
I'll vote for you.
Yeah, I will not be running. And I admire,
Look at the cameras.
I admire anybody that's willing to do it.
I want to turn to another rather contentious topic in last night's debate and the debates before that and the vice presidential debate, and that is, of course, Russia. The difference between the candidates could not have been more starker last night. Again, it's the one that's come up the most in the debates. And last night, Secretary Clinton brought up the U.S. intelligence community's assessment that Russia had indeed been involved in the DNC and email hacks. And the Obama administration has outright accused Russia of trying to meddle in the U.S. election. Before we get to, what do we do with Putin? Jill, is there any precedence for Russia meddling like this?
In the sense that, excuse me, well, I would say Russia, the Soviet Union, has meddled in elections all over the world for many years, primarily, though, in Europe, where they would, fund political parties and have leftists and all sorts of, this has been going on for years and years. But in this way, with the web, the internet, hacking, et cetera, of course we haven't had it because we didn't have the technical means for guys to go in and hack until relatively recently. So this is a big deal. And I would say that it's a very big deal in terms of a challenge to President Obama right now and also the next president to decide how you actually respond to what is going on. Because this sets a precedent. And Donald Trump's views aside, as you pointed out, the Director of National Intelligence and Homeland Security all believe that the preponderance of the evidence is that the Russians did it, and that the Russians at the very highest level, which, as Hillary said last night, Putin himself, but of course, that's what they mean by this. One of the problems is that the Russian answer, and it's kind of Donald Trump's answer, is we don't know, or the Russians say, prove it. But the problem with proving it is we can't say how we prove it, because then you reveal what are called sources and methods of collecting intelligence. So we would have to say, well, we've been tapping President Putin's phone for all these years, and that's how we can prove it. So we can't. There are some people like General Stavridis, who has suggested, Admiral Stavridis, sorry.
You promoted him.
Yes, oh dear, and especially with the Navy over here, oh my goodness. But Admiral Stavridis has said that you could sanitize some of that and basically say, we collected this and we guaranteed because X. But that's a problem. So when the Russians say, prove it, they know that basically we can't without revealing things. But I do think, as I said, that it's very serious and you have to do something. So Admiral Stavridis has said there are about 6 different things you could do in different levels of responding. But that's another, we won't go into that at this point. But that's setting up right now what you do about it.
What is Putin hoping to achieve if Russia's behind
Yeah.
this? Is it actually to influence the outcome of the election, or is it to further make Americans uncertain about the process?
You know, I would say there are probably 4 different levels. I mean, one of them is very basic. The Russian intelligence agencies, and they use hackers and everybody else, they vacuum up information. That is what they get paid to do, just as our guys and girls get paid to vacuum up as much information as you possibly can. Now, I would argue that they go further with some of this hacking than we do, and meddling in elections is one part. But basically, their job is to collect information. And they have collected information on Donald Trump, not just Hillary Clinton, not just the DNC, and not just the Clinton staff, etc., John Podesta. So that's number one, just part of the way you do business. Number 2 would be they've collected information, and then obviously I would make the leap here. Let me just jump out there and say they've given it, or in some fashion, Julian Assange has gotten it. Julian Assange hates Hillary, and he also doesn't like the United States government. He used to not like government in general. Now he's kind of morphed into not liking the United States government. And so he basically is a nihilist who just wants to bring it all down. So he's using it. He could also just ask for the emails about Donald Trump, but he hasn't done that. So there's a purpose. Those are probably out there to be used at a different time. I would argue they could be out there to be used if Trump were elected. It would be great to have the emails that you could use, or whatever information. Kompromat, as the Russians say, compromising material. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 would be, there's a theory, do they want Donald Trump? Well, I think that's pretty primitive. Yes and no. I mean, it's useful to have Donald Trump saying nice things about Putin, but do they really trust that Donald Trump will be nice to Putin were he to be elected? No, and I can tell you from a trip to Moscow, I go there frequently, just a couple of months ago, there are people in the Kremlin who say Trump is very unpredictable. We don't know what he's going to do. So it sounds good, but will he really be a friend of the United States? I mean, I think they're moving more in that direction because they really do dislike Hillary, whom they blame for instigating revolution against Putin. They believe that Hillary and the Obama administration want to carry out regime change against Putin. So obviously you like the other guy who's not talking about regime change. But then I would also say, to your third point there, that this would be, let's say, level 4, they do want to undermine belief in Western democracy. They want to undermine any belief that government works, and it's it's a great way to do it. You already have that narrative coming from Donald Trump, which is everything is a scam, it's all a lie. Government is useless and actually a very bad force in your lives, and it will all be fraudulent, et cetera. The Russians say that all the time. Russian propaganda, which is kind of my area of expertise, that is the narrative that you get from Russian media and propaganda, which is it's all a scam. Don't trust the government. You can't trust anyone. And then also, I would say there's a 5th reason, which is, the phrase, all politics is local. Okay, in Russia, all politics is local. Believe it or not, Putin does things not because of Obama, not because of the United States, but because of his own domestic situation. And President Putin is facing his own presidential election in 2018. And the jockeying and the preparation for that has already begun. So why would he use this? Well, the United States is almost guaranteed to say in 2018 that the Russian elections have been fraudulent, or at least not completely democratic. So this is kind of like a little inoculation early. to say, you think our elections in Russia are fraudulent? Look at those Americans. They had a disaster. They had two candidates who were, all over the place, and one of them said that it was going to be fraudulent. And you think that we have problems? Look at them. And Putin has done this for years. Putin, just Google Putin Electoral College. And you can see what he said like 2 or 3 years ago, which is democracy, an electoral college, that's democracy? That there are these guys who go into a room and decide the election. It's not a free democratic election. I mean, so what he's doing is he is both for international consumption, but very much for domestic Russian consumption. He is saying, listen, Russians, we will have a democratic election in 2018. And if there are any doubts, you just look at the paragon of democracy, the United States, and what a debacle they had in 2016. So I think, again, there are probably 5 reasons that he's doing it.
There could be a few more, too.
Yeah.
So I'll make this my last question. We'll come back to Russia, and then I'll turn it over to you. So be thinking about your questions. There are some really big ticket items that we haven't gotten to yet, but I want to make sure that we get a chance for you to jump in, and you can ask the questions I haven't asked. So would a Trump presidency embolden an already incredibly bold Vladimir Putin, and Hillary Clinton might be able to rein him in, although Obama hasn't had a whole lot of success on that? Or is, coming back to your point about Russian politics, it's all domestic, is Putin's calculus not fundamentally going to change whoever is in the White House?
You mean, will he change them, or would they change
Would they
him?
change Putin's calculus?
Oh, yeah, I think definitely. I mean, if Trump gets in, Trump has already said that he might meet with Vladimir Putin before he's inaugurated, okay? Vladimir Putin would love that. Why? Because Vladimir Putin wants what could be described as Yalta II. You divide up the world. I mean, he kind of is lonely for the good old days when there were 2 superpowers who basically kind of decided what happened in the world. So I can tell you, I watch the Russian media all the time. They are thrilled that they are center stage in this election because people used to ignore them. No one paid attention. Now everyone's paying attention. And as President Putin has said, well, it's flattering to be the center of attention in the American election. That really is true. So I think, Trump, it would be the 2 leaders, very strong leaders, the United States and Russia, the way it used to be during the Cold War, and the Russians would be thrilled to carve up the world according to the way they wanted. And that would be very nice because then you could kind of give the Baltics back. And there are all sorts of things that you could do to kind of dismantle. I'm joking in a way, but I think you see my point. The Russians really do want to be the deciders, and it bothers them that they aren't. So if you had a Yalta II, they would have another role. With Hillary, I think one of the problems could be that she would be so hard and so insulting about Vladimir Putin that it could be really like this. And in the long run, NATO can defeat Russia, definitely. But they can make life really miserable in terms of little things. Well, maybe, Bill,
I just want to ask you a question about that.
Okay, well, but
I think the one moderating thing, if Hillary is elected, is that the person, I think that Ash Carter would stay as Secretary of Defense, and as you know, he's really well-versed in Russian matters. And I think that whoever became the Secretary of State, I think that 2 of those people would be a moderating influence on President Clinton in her kind of any effort to go tough with to get tough with Russia, if you want to. What do you think about that? Do you think that
I totally agree with that. But one thing I'd say is that Vladimir Putin uses every bit of leverage that he can in almost any situation to make himself heard. And he is not going away. He's not going to magically just kind of say, oh, okay, Hillary, you're in charge, I'm standing back. What he will do is in every single international conflict or any problem around the world, he will try to inject Russia as a force for deciding that. And so in Syria, he's done that. He's now in the Middle East. We haven't even talked about China. You know, he talks about China as kind of their big friend, you know, in the East. Everywhere Russia wants to play a role, and you can bet that he will be a real challenge to the next president in doing just that.
Okay. So again, I have so much more we could keep talking about, but I would like to make sure you get your chance. So there are microphones that will be passed around. I will call on you, please. Do you want everyone to identify themselves or just launch into the question?
Whatever. I mean,
Just say hi, who
We
you
wanna
are.
know who you are.
And please, we've only got just over half an hour, so let's make sure we're asking questions and not giving speeches or running commentary. And if we could keep it as quick as possible, and if the answers could be brief as well, we'll try and get in as many questions as we have. And with that, who would like to jump in? In the aisle there, please. Other side.
Hi, thank you. My name is Iga Kozlowska. I'm a doctoral candidate in sociology at Northwestern University in Chicago. I just wanted to follow up on the Russia issue and ask Jill or Bill, why hasn't Obama been able to rein Putin in? And what can the next president do differently? What kind of weaknesses of Putin's can he or she exploit, like the crumbling economy, or maybe something in his close circle of oligarchs, something that would get him to change course? Thank you.
well, I'll just jump in quickly. I think it's very difficult, you know, reining him in. I mean, we wanted to work with him in the beginning. You know, the idea of the reset, which everybody kind of laughs at, but it was to kind of get things back on track and work on the things that we both have common interest in.
And it had some real accomplishments.
And it did. I mean, we had the New START agreement, which I think is really one of the most important, which was arms control. So, you know, there were areas, but, you know, I keep going back to that domestic part of it. You know, Putin, when he was riding high with a lot of money and oil prices were high, he was back on the stage and wanted to, you know, show that Russia had influence. And so he began to move back into areas. He rebuilt the military, for instance, at least began that process. So, you know, then, of course, the economy goes bad. You have a situation in Ukraine, which actually began as an economic issue. It wasn't a military issue. And Putin just decided, some people have this theory, that he doesn't really have a long-term strategy other than being in the decider's seat, but that he saw Ukraine was going to be slipping into the Western orbit and wanted to stop that. So there's quite a fair amount of, let's say not strategic, but tactical action by Putin. At this point, I don't think we can rein him in. I think what we have to do is begin to talk to him like the president of just another country, not like the former Soviet Union. Not draw some lines, but show that we're going to be firm with supporting our allies, but also begin to look at some of the other areas where you can cooperate, like trade, which is very difficult to do because they don't sell much, you know, but begin to look at areas that kind of deflate the emotion about the relationship, but be firm about the fact that we are going to stand up for supporting countries, especially our allies in Europe.
Completely agree. I think Jill said something earlier in her comments about this that are really important here, and that is all politics are local. We have a tendency when you hear a pronouncement by a foreign leader, especially Putin, to think that he's talking to us. Everything Mr. Putin says is aimed at the Russian electorate, if you will, and Russian public opinion. And so I would say one of the biggest challenges for Secretary Clinton, if she's elected, is that she and Putin know each other and they don't like each other. And so for them to form a friendly relationship in the future is going to be difficult. So it might be up to a new surrogate, Ash Carter, or the new Secretary of State, or a special ambassador. Maybe she'll bring Strobe Talbot back and make him the special ambassador to Russia. And it needs to be a personal relationship that's conducted behind closed doors, not for public consumption, in order to even begin a useful dialogue, in my view. I don't know how you feel about that. Any kind of public diplomacy here isn't going to work.
But what about the sanctions, which you brought up, which has kind of been the only tool we've had? And sanctions alone haven't hurt Putin, but the collapse in oil prices combined with sanctions, which stopped Russian companies from getting external financing, reduced access to credit, FDI, the ruble's down by half. Russian GDP is down. Russians are spending 55% of their income on food, which are African poverty level statistics for spending. If all politics is local and the Russian people are hurting and sanction relief could help bolster Putin, could we be using sanctions? If we continued sanctions, could that be a pressure point for Putin?
We've been trying it. I mean, the whole idea of sanctions was not to punish them, but to get him to change his actions in Ukraine, and it hasn't worked. So I don't think sanctions are going to work in that way. And although I do think they're hurting the economy, and I think they're hurting friends of Putin, but that theory that maybe you could squeeze some of the leadership, or the friends of the leadership, and then they would put pressure on Putin also isn't working. One thing that Americans don't realize, or at least maybe even in Washington they don't, is that Putin is using sanctions to pull Russians together.
Right.
And he is saying, look, we suffered in World War II, we defeated Hitler, we are the best sufferers in the world, we can join together. And I will tell you, 2 months ago, and I see it even more now, there is literally war fever in Russia. The government is saying that the United States is practically about to attack. They have held exercises with civilians and emergency groups preparing for something, big attacks. People in Moscow that I talked to, cab drivers and many others, think that the United States is about to invade Russia and maybe even use nuclear weapons. They are using this to create great fear among the Russian people about the outside. And why would they do that? Because it unites the people and it helps them to forget that they can't get imported cheese and the prices are increasing and they don't, suddenly the job that you had with the Western company is gone because the Western company is gone. So, sanctions the Kremlin is exploiting sanctions to increase anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
May I? Everything she said, 100% true. The best thing about the sanctions is that they're there, and if I was Secretary Clinton, I would make getting rid of the sanctions a priority and try to use it in a positive way, the lifting of the sanctions. Sanctions are, for some reason, very politically popular in the United States because we think nobody dies, and so it's not a war, and it's a good thing. There are only 2 cases that I know of in modern history where sanctions have been effective. One was South Africa and the sanctions against apartheid, and ironically, the other one is the sanctions against Iran, which brought Iran to the bargaining table recently, and we've had all kinds of wide condemnation when every objective that we set forth when we put the sanctions in place was accomplished, and they did everything we asked them to do, and then the Republicans said, well, that's not enough. We need to make the sanctions tougher. It's only the second time. And we had 50 years of sanctions against Cuba, which accomplished exactly what? There's no other. And sanctions in Russia just helps Putin, and it hurts the Russian people, helps Putin. Not a good answer.
But Bill, you, coming from the White House now, as the new president, will have to decide. What you're going to get is people saying, you are rewarding Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And
well, this is why it requires leadership.
Yeah, so it took so much effort to get the Europeans on board,
Yeah.
and you're going to give up sanctions.
The
So this
Europeans
is
will not,
This is heavy lifting.
just as the
Okay.
Europeans were very happy to lift sanctions against Iran, they're going to be very happy to lift sanctions
They
against
will.
Russia.
They will.
And it will not be a tough sell in Europe. The only place it's going to be a tough sell is on the right side of the aisle in Congress. And this is why we need a president that's a leader to accomplish this stuff. It's not easy, but the idea that somehow, well, the sanctions aren't working, so let's make them tougher, that's not going to do it.
Next question. In the front here, please.
As you say, all politics are local. And I have a question on climate change. In Washington State here, we are very shortly facing an initiative on cap and trade. And
Can you maybe just speak up a bit? Even with the mic, I don't think you're quite getting to the back of the room.
okay.
There we go.
There.
Good.
Okay. So we're facing this initiative on cap and trade, and it's a very confusing initiative. And I'm wondering if you're aware of what the candidates have in cap and trade that might affect the Paris Accord and get us to a goal. And any insights about this local initiative? Some people are saying it's a good one, and others are saying it's not a good one, but we still need it.
Right.
And how to vote is...
So I'll try to keep it short. So the initiative is actually for a carbon tax, which is a bit different from cap and trade. So it would basically impose a fee on the emission of carbon dioxide from power plants and industrial facilities and things like that. It's designed to be revenue neutral. So they would tax carbon dioxide and reduce sales taxes and business taxes and things of that nature. So, it's in principle a great idea. You tax something you don't want and you reduce taxes on things that you would like to see more of. So more economic activity. There's a whole lot of politics around it. So there are folks in the environmental community who aren't happy with that structure. They would like to see more of the revenue from the tax being used to fund other kinds of renewable energy efficiency activities, and helping disadvantaged communities and things of that nature. So that's part of the confusing politics around it. Meanwhile, the governor has, through an executive order, established what is more like a cap and trade program. It was just enacted a few weeks ago. So that's moving in parallel. So there's a lot of activity, and it's tough. I have sympathies with folks in the environmental community who don't like this thing, but my own position is this is an urgent problem. We need to do something with it, and I'd like to see it passed. At the national level, the politics are much more difficult, I would say. You see some parallels. The Obama administration has put forward what they call the Clean Power Plan, which is an effort to reduce emissions from the power sector, from power plants. And it's going through legal challenge now, basically, as an executive order. But it could develop into something that looks like a cap and trade program. But the issue was that the Obama administration was not able to get a cap and trade program through Congress. We got very close. Legislation passed the House back in 2009, but it didn't get through the Senate. But since then, the national politics on climate change have really shifted direction. That legislation 8 or so years ago was bipartisan in nature, and it would be hard, I think, extremely hard to imagine a bipartisan bill passing Congress right now.
Ask Derik a question.
Sure, yeah.
Derik, from my vantage point, I viewed this initiative as a kind of a public continuation of the efforts by the political leaders here in the Seattle region and at the state level, as you pointed out with Governor Inslee, to demonstrate some leadership on the climate change issue and try to influence the national debate. And I think there's a tendency when we look at the initiative to think, well, this is some kind of a solution or this will be in place 10 years from now. I think it's just a marker that people are trying to put down to say we need to do something about climate change, and we need to do it on a national basis, not just on a statewide basis, but to get the state of Washington on record as saying, hey, look, our public supports this. What do you think about that?
Very much so. And that's been, there's been a lot of state activity. It's kind of waxed and waned over the last 10, 15 years. But you've got California, you've got the Northeast with their own programs. At one point, Washington and Oregon, along with California, were all part of this Western Climate Initiative, which was going to create a system like what California has in all 3 Western states and a number of other states and Canadian provinces. The economic downturn basically crushed that effort, at least here and in Oregon. But the strategy all along has been to get facts on the ground in the states that are going to make the logic of a national solution much more compelling. Companies that are regulated under these systems don't want to see this patchwork of taxes here and cap and trade there, and in different states that they operate. It's much easier to have one national system, and that's the logic, essentially.
So you're going to vote for it?
It's going to be hard for me to not vote for it.
So am I.
Yes, in the back, thanks.
My name is Wen Liu, and I'm an independent writer and interpreter. I came with a question for Joe Borich, but he's not here. So I will give this question to Jill. President Obama and Hillary Clinton had this policy of pivot to Asia to check China's influence, especially over the South China Sea controversy. Now, Philippines, they have a new president. He just said, U.S., bye-bye. I'm going to ally with China. So could you say something about now where Asia pivot is?
Wow. Well, I mean, Asia pivot began, and then all of a sudden we had things happening in Ukraine, et cetera. And Europe, which had been kind of an afterthought for quite a while, came back roaring onto the scene. And it's really now kind of taken over what should have been a very obvious pivot, because in the long run, I mean, if you just look at the economies of China and Russia, there's no comparison, But China is, I think, very long-term, and I think it will be the biggest challenge to the next president to really manage that relationship correctly, because the Chinese are, to my mind, quite smart in terms of how they're doing this. You look everywhere, Central Asia, Africa, they are everywhere, and they are building. And it's really, as they describe it, as a peaceful rise. And I think you might make that argument, except what's happening in the South China Sea. So it's another very complex relationship, but I think we ought to keep our eye very much on the ball with China, because they are the people who will define the world that we're going to be living in. I'm shocked and horrified by what's going on with the Philippines. I mean, who would have thought that could possibly happen? And also, they're talking about Russia too, becoming friendly with Russia and with China. It's very destabilizing. It's pretty crazy. But he seems to be getting support because of, the problem with these drug dealers and everything. Again, domestic issues. But I don't know. That seems, though, in the long run, that will probably resolve itself. China's there for keeps.
The Asia pivot is here to stay, and let's not forget Russia considers themselves to be an Asian power, and they are, on the Pacific Ocean. probably the most important relationship the next president will have to manage over the course of, let's say, an 8-year, 2-term presidency, the relationship between the United States and China. And if I was going to give that president any advice, it would be very simple, which is there is no reason why the United States and China have to be enemies. And unfortunately, there are many people in this country that see that as an inevitable consequence of world history or something. The United States and China have many more interests in common, including peace and global stability and prosperity, than we do in conflict. And we need to focus on those interests that we have in common. Americans have very little understanding of China. Just a fraction of this population have ever been to China, and we don't understand China. And the same is very much true of the Chinese. But the Chinese are working a lot harder at understanding us than we are at understanding them. Jill and I will teach a class with 20 students starting in January. I guarantee you 2 of the 20 will be Chinese students who speak flawless English and are not immigrating to the United States. They will be going back to China. And, all across this country, there are Chinese students studying in the United States, studying the United States, not for the purpose of undermining the United States. I've met many of them that are very critical of the government of China and want to see reform and progress and change there. But the key thing for the American public to understand and the president to understand is that there is no reason the United States and China have to be enemies. There's a lot of focus on this issue in the South China Sea. I'm not being cynical here. I'm being honest when I tell you if we had those same things in the Gulf of Mexico, the United States would be doing it in the Gulf of Mexico, and we wouldn't bat an eye. And we'd be doing it in a heartbeat. The difference, of course, being there's nobody other than Mexico there, and we would come up with some kind of a deal with Mexico to make it worthwhile. We groused about it in the South China Sea, but ultimately it's going to be a fait accompli.
And I would just quickly amplify that.
I was actually going to ask you on U.S., China, and climate. So.
Right, exactly. I mean, when it comes to climate, not only is there no reason for us to be enemies, I would say we actually need to be friends.
Amen.
And to date, we have been. I mean, a few months before the Paris Agreement, the U.S. and China jointly announced what their commitment would be going into the agreement. And that had a big impact, I think, in building the momentum to getting that agreement in place.
It was U.S.-China at loggerheads that doomed Copenhagen, right?
It was. That was a big part of it. It kind of fell apart at the last minute because there really wasn't good consultation there. And some goings on behind the scenes that really poisoned the well. But it's been really, really different this time around. And in fact, the John Podesta emails, they've been a treasure trove of interesting insights. But today there was a story about how there was a whole email chain between the lead U.S. negotiator and the lead Chinese negotiator, and what a friendly relationship they had, how they really had respect for each other. And I think that was key to the Paris Agreement. I think that's a key relationship going forward that I hope is maintained.
If I could add something else. We didn't get to talk about China, and Joe's not here, so I will channel Joe for a few minutes. I really encourage as many Americans as possible to go to China. It's a revelation. It's not like you think it is. And last night, those of you that watched the debate know that Donald Trump said that the Chinese economy was growing by 8%. That's a significant overstatement. It's probably 6%, which is very healthy, but it's fragile growth, and it's also very spotty. I mean, it's a big country and very diverse economically, and they have huge sections of their economy and their population that are not benefiting from the growth much in the same manner we do here. It's a much bigger problem for them. You heard Jill say, I agree completely, that maybe our biggest national security threat in this country was that economic instability caused by the economic insecurity of people in this country. Same thing in China, and the leadership in China is very worried about it. They really haven't been able to come to grips with it yet. Their economy is transforming. And this is ironic because you keep hearing, all the jobs are going to China. Well, 20 years ago in China, there were, I'm going to try really hard to get the numbers right. I don't have them in front of me, about 150 million manufacturing jobs in China. Today, there are about 130 million. There are 20 million less manufacturing jobs in China today than there were 20 years ago. That may not trouble you. Remember, in the United States, our manufacturing crisis is we went from 16 million down to 13.5. So they lost 20 million, and we only had 16 million to start with. Well, if all our manufacturing jobs are going to China, in China they're going, all the manufacturing jobs are going to Cambodia. And what's happening, of course, is this economic transformation isn't confined to the United States. You cannot build a cell phone with a hammer. The new technologies require vastly different workforces, much more use of technology and robotics and things like that, and the Chinese are coming along. That's point number one about China. The other thing is, and I think maybe one of the greatest sources of misunderstanding on the part of the U.S. public is we don't understand that people in China don't care what we think. That's hard for us to grasp, because we really believe we're in the center of the universe. When you go to China and you try to express an opinion about, well, we in the United States we think you ought to do this, it doesn't even register. It's like, yeah, so what? I would characterize their opinion, and this is a little bit glib, but it would be like in the last 2,000 years, 18 out of the 20 centuries, in the last 2,000 years, the dominant economy in the globe was China, and the last 2 centuries have just been an aberration. We're returning to normal. And thank you for your opinion. That's a little bit glib, but it tries to illustrate just kind of the intellectual gulf that we have to close. I think our leadership in the United States, pretty knowledgeable about China. We need to bring the public along so that the public doesn't demand that we go to war. We don't need to go to war.
Okay, we've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. In the back, please, or kind of, yep, you in the hat. There's a microphone coming.
So, Valinas is a foreign policy strategist that advised Hillary Clinton during her tenure as Secretary of State on Iraq and Afghanistan. And he once remarked that Clinton is part of the traditional foreign policy establishment. And these are people who believe in the use of U.S. military to assert U.S. influence around the world. So do you think, or do you anticipate a Clinton presidency to mark a proliferation in U.S. interventions around the world?
Is Hillary Clinton hawkish?
I think that Donald Trump and some of Republican opponents have tried to portray her as hawkish. I think Hillary is well aware of the capabilities of the U.S. military, and she's also aware of the limitations of military power. And I'll use not a perfect example, but the example of my generation. I'm 70. I grew up in the Vietnam era, and so a lot of my thinking about national security affairs is colored by my own experience in Vietnam. President Clinton will have lived through the post-9/11 era, and she will have seen what happened as a consequence of our overreach in Afghanistan and Iraq, but particularly Iraq. If we had just stuck to Afghanistan, we probably would have been okay. And I think she's going to be very reluctant to start a war on another front. Also, Donald Trump likes to say that our military is degraded. That it's not true. The military the capability is world class. The spending levels are where they ought to be, troop levels are where they ought to be, but they are tired, especially the Army and Marine Corps. And if we continue to abuse them and misuse them, there'll be a consequence. And I think Secretary Clinton is well aware of that on a gut level, different from many other people. So I'm not anticipating any rush to war in the next 4 years if Secretary Clinton's elected. I don't know any other way to say it. And I know Dr. Carter very well. When Dr. Carter was the Assistant Secretary of Defense, he was my immediate counterpart when I was Admiral in the Joint Staff. And we traveled all over, especially in the former Soviet Union, together for 4 years. He's not going to be constantly whispering in Secretary Clinton's ear that we need to go to war. He's going to be telling her we need to find options other than war, options other than conflict, options other than the use of force. And I suspect that she will surround herself with advisors that come very much from that mold. Not that we won't maintain the capability, but I think having the capability and not using it can be just as effective as having the capability, or more effective. Having the capability and not using it will be more effective than having the capability and misusing it.
Very quickly, I totally agree with what Bill is saying. And, I covered Hillary Clinton both in the White House when her husband was president, and also in the State Department. And, she's a big believer in diplomacy. I mean, that's what she did for 4 years. And although some, would criticize her, but there are a lot of, don't forget, relations of the United States with the rest of the world were in a pretty bad shape when Obama came in. And I do think that Secretary Clinton definitely believes in diplomacy and also development. I mean, she's the quintessential development person. Women, families and economic development. And she also created a women's ambassador, and she also created a very robust trade part for the State Department, which goes out and actually sells American business and the ability to trade with other countries. So I think she has a lot, as she would put it, she has a lot in the toolkit.
One other thing about that, and that's about the current election and the politics of the election. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but Hillary Clinton is a woman, okay? And in order to convince people that she's qualified to be commander-in-chief, she has to walk a very fine line between convincing them that she's willing to use force, while at the same time that she has the restraint to not use force. And so I think that has caused some of this concern that you talked about. I don't know if you agree with me on that or not.
Absolutely. She has to look tough because she's a woman, but she can't overplay that.
But not too tough.
Yeah, she has to be tough, but not too tough.
Otherwise, we're in a war.
All right, we've got about a minute left, so we don't have time for another question. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists, I'm going to start with Derik. What is the #1 foreign policy priority of the next president, day one? You can only pick one. Derik, what are you going to say?
Well, I'm biased, right? There's still a lot of more work that needs to be done. The Paris Agreement is just a first step, so I would.
So you're sticking with climate?
Yeah, I'm going to.
Okay, Jill.
Nukes. Nuclear weapons. I think that if you figure that the president, whoever it is going to sit down in the White House, and if there is information from his staff that there is an incoming missile from Russia, they have approximately 15 to 20 minutes to decide whether to answer it. And the world can be destroyed in a half an hour. I mean, missiles can be in our living rooms in a half an hour. And don't forget all the missiles that we have right here in Seattle. So I think nuclear weapons, arms control is in very dire shape. So my first priority would be getting an extension of the New START agreement, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. Get that extended for another 5 years, so at least we have something working. But I think arms control, it sounds like an old thing, but it's crucial.
Something happier, Bill, come on.
More basic, yeah. I talked about leadership. The new president has to exercise leadership, and fundamentally important in the days before she takes office is picking a foreign policy team, starting with Secretary Carter getting the right Secretary of State, getting the right National Security Advisor, getting the right people around her to give her the advice and give her the courage to lead on these difficult issues. We keep talking about this like it's the president that does all this stuff. The president is only one person, and this government does not work from the top down. It works from the bottom up. The national security policy apparatus helps the president know what needs to be done, set the priorities, what courses of action are. And so the people that she chooses to put in these positions are going to be critical. And, you know, we focus a lot on the Supreme Court. I would focus just as much on that. You look back to the Bush administration as an example, and you can see the consequences of some choices that were made there that resulted in some decisions that we regret now. So I think that's it. Leadership and the choice of the people to fill the key leadership positions. And if, insofar as the economic piece, the people she puts on her National Economic Council, just as much attention. I hope she does bring back Robert Reich. I don't know if he's willing to go another round, but.
Well, with that, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an engaging discussion tonight.
I'm willing to stay and answer questions.